Influencing Others Without Formal Authority. I would like to welcome two esteemed faculty panelists, Dr. Dean Gualco and Dr. Henry Brashen. Daniel Pink wrote a book called To Sell is Human. His main point in that book was that we don't necessarily need to be salespeople to have to sell ideas. Whether we're doctors, teachers, administrators, or lawyers, we are in the business of commonly influencing other people that we don't have formal authority over. And so we're really excited to host this webinar this evening to discuss influencing others without formal authority. So before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce our Career Services Center team. We are all located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we have our Associate Director, Dina Berggren, Senior Career Advisor, Angie Lira, Nicole Skalski, Senior Career Advisor, who is our technical moderator this evening, and Denise Pranke. And we aspire to be a global, cutting-edge career services center preparing our learners to navigate career transition over a lifetime. To achieve this vision, we educate, coach, and advise our learners to proactively manage their careers. I'd now like to start by introducing our esteemed panelists. Dr. Dean Gualco is a faculty member in human resources with Walden. He is a noted author and public speaker who has served as a municipality city department director, organizational leader, university professor, and owner of Torgan Consulting. He is the author of 7 books, including The Great People of Our Time and Making a Difference, Changing the World in Which You Live. And then our next presenter is Dr. Henry Brashen, also from the School of Management. He is a program director for the MS in Leadership and MS in Human Resources programs. He has been an educator for more than 30 years. His research interests include leadership, cyberbullying in higher education, stress in the online world, intercultural communication, gender communication, conflict resolution, and nonverbal communication. He has worked with various organizations to provide expertise in the areas of leadership, succession planning, strategic human resources management, organizational development, executive coaching, research and design methodology, conflict and mediation, and facilitation and training. In his free time, he's a ventriloquist, a runner, and long-distance swimmer. I just love saying that every time about Dr. Brashen. He's a ventriloquist. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole, who's going to launch a poll.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa. So before we get started and pass it over to Dean for our topic today, we kind of just want to get some answers from our audience of what brought you to this webinar today. Describe the type of influence you would most like to have. Impact positive social change in your community. Influence others in your workplace or professional field. Have a positive influence over your personal relationships or other. And I'll give everyone a minute to answer the poll. We know that most Walden students also come to Walden because of the social change mission. So we know it's important to our audience and as well as our faculty and staff. Okay, we'll give it just a few more seconds. It looks like over 80% have voted. Thanks for your participation. 86 have voted, 86%. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share it with everyone. So look at that, 51% in your workplace or professional field. Following up with 31% to impact social change in your community, and also 14% having positive influence in your personal relationships. So great, that fits in well with career while you're at Walden in the social change mission. And now with that, hopefully we'll be addressing how to become more impactful in some of those areas. And I will hand it over to our main speaker, Dean.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for taking a few minutes out of your day to be with us today as we talk about the skills and the abilities that you need to have influence in your environment. The good thing is that the skills that will help you have influence in your profession are the same skills that will help you have influence in your social life, having a social change, have a change in your social environment. So it's that same set of skills that you can learn. And by the way, they're all very learnable. Every single person on this webinar has the ability to gain influence in their environment. We're going to give you 6 strategies or traits to do that, but it is something that every single person can do. The first slide that you saw is always look for the good along the road of life. Positivity is so much a factor in influence. In fact, when you look at some of the most influential people that you meet, they often tend to be the most positive because we're drawn to positivity. Colin Powell, who was the former Secretary of State, said that positivity is a force multiplier, and he means that it's so infectious. That's one of the characteristics we're going to talk about later in regards to having this ability to influence your environment. By the way, when we talk about environment, it could be your spouse or significant other, it could be your immediate family, it could be your neighborhood, it can be your workplace. Environment is universal to whatever you choose as that aspect that you want to influence. It could be your parents or your children. That's your environment. So here's our agenda. We're going to give you some definitions first. By the way, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in there. We'd love to answer any questions that you have. So please feel free to share that with us. And a question you may have is also a question somebody else may have. So certainly go ahead and ask those questions. So here's our agenda. We'll start getting right into some definitions. We always find that when you talk about a subject, you really should define the subject, because the way I define it may not be the same way that somebody else defines it. So if we have a universal definition when we start this presentation, then we all know we have the same foundation. And I think that that's important. So the first thing that we really want to talk about is authority, because we're talking about influence. And influence really comes from 2 sources. The first of which is authority. Of course, this is a seminar, a webinar talking about how to gain influence with power, not necessarily authority. Authority is pretty easy to gain influence in. If I'm your supervisor and I tell you something to do, you have to do it. If you don't do it, of course, you can lose your job. And so you don't have to be very good. You don't have to have very many abilities or skills to influence somebody when you have authority over them. But here's something to consider that really puts this into perspective. And that is, with authority, you can only influence the people that you have authority over. For instance, if you work in the finance department and you want to have authority over people in the finance department, you do have that authority. You can tell anybody in the finance department, this is what I want you to do. But if you want to tell somebody in the human resources department to do something, you have no authority to tell them what to do. You have to rely on something else. And that something else is what we call power. And that's the next slide that you see, which is power. Power is the ability to influence someone or events. And really this forms the substance of our entire presentation. We want power. Power often has such a negative implication in our environment, and it really shouldn't. If you're a powerful person, that often means that you're influential. Now, some of that can come from authority, but we have talked about how authority is always limited. For instance, the greatest definition is if you're president of the United States, you have authority in the United States, but you don't have authority over Canada. And those are the 2 differences. But if you become a person who has universal influence, then you can have influence outside of your own country. So really, our whole focus here is, how do I get power? How do I get power in my workplace, in my home place? What skills and abilities do I need to develop? And that's really where we're going to spend our time for the remaining parts of this discussion. We do know that we like polls. We want to hear from you. I think sometimes when I take webinars, you just don't want to sit there and have somebody talk to you all the time. So we want to get your feedback. And so we have the second poll. All of these polls help our discussion too. It helps me understand some of the areas that you would like to converse in this webinar. So please take the time to answer this question, which is, and you're going to have to type it in, what do you view as the single most important trait to gain influence over others? I'm going to later in this presentation offer some to you, but I want to get your opinion first. Is what do you think is the single most important thing you can do to influence somebody else?
Great. Thank you, Dean. So what you all can do is type in the question box, and we'll give everyone a minute. Oh, they're already flying in. Okay, we have empathy, diplomacy, think before you speak. This is great. Gain trust. A lot of people are saying trust. Be an example or a model. Likability, charisma, being authentic, trustworthy, building relationships, being around people like you, honesty, integrity. Let's see, influence others. Feel like, okay, humble, basically. Not above others, but equal to them. Relatedness and showing concern for others, and your knowledge. Excellent. I think I'll stop it there. We have a lot of trustworthiness.
I'd like to offer a thought on this, because I do see a theme here from what everyone has shared, and this is Henry Brashen.
Yes.
And the theme I see is actually listening. It's something that's often done the most and taught the least. But as Dean had shared in his first slide, when you want to influence someone, when you want to be liked or respected, if you can take a step back and listen, and not listen to think about what you're going to say next, but listen to really understand what the other person is saying. And when you do that, the other person will gravitate towards you because you're talking about their stuff and not your stuff. And that's one of the key things that I've found. And people have often said to me, they say, Henry, you seem to have the glib conversation. And I said, no, most of the time I don't know what to say, so I just listen. And then I get all this information where I can then respond. And it works really well. And it's something that we can all do. So really good. I do see this theme.
Great.
And let me offer two more things on what Henry just said. When you take communication classes, one of the things they tell you is, remember, you have one mouth and two ears. And the point being is they want you to listen twice as much as you talk. And it's kind of an interesting metaphor, if you will, about two ears and one mouth. We also know that you can listen 3 times faster than you can talk. And the last thing I'd say, and this is why Henry's absolutely right about listening, is we also learn that people like to talk about themselves. So if you try this tomorrow or next week, go have a conversation with somebody. But instead of doing most of the talking or any of the talking, actually listen during that whole time. And then later ask that person what they thought of the conversation. And they'll probably say something like, best conversation I ever had. I really enjoyed talking to you. Oh, you're the greatest person to talk to. I'd love to spend more time with you. And you can go back and thinking, gosh, I didn't really say anything. But that's the importance of how people, if you give people a chance to talk, then they like you so much more. That's a great point that Henry brought up. The other thing that I would say about the poll, which I really liked, is did you see how many of the responses were on personal traits? What's interesting when we talk about influence, people think that you have to learn this theory or you have to go through this program. And what you all are saying, which is exactly, it's almost like you looked at our presentation before we gave it, is personal characteristics are the most important attribute or trait that you can have in order to have influence in your environment. It is things like trust and be an example and be a model and be likable and have charisma. Those are traits that if you possess them and if you learn them, because they're all learnable, as I said in the beginning, then you can gain influence in your environment. And what is influence? Your next slide talks about what influence is. It's a pretty easy definition. By the way, some of the slides, I don't go through each slide. I always figure you can read them and you can read them later, but I'm just trying to summarize them for you, and I pick out the important parts. But influence, if you want to remember what influence is, it's just a change in your behavior that causes a change in somebody else's behavior. To those people who put in, you need to model, you need to be some kind of model of behavior, that's what influence is. If it's as easy as if you're walking down the street and someone's walking, but then you start running and they start running, that's influence. By the change in what you did has caused somebody else to change. And that's what we want to do in influence. If we have a subordinate that we're trying to get to work harder, we're trying to influence them to change that behavior. And that's all in reality influence is. So our whole presentation is to try to figure out, how can I change the behavior of somebody else to be the behavior that I want them to express? It could be as easy as our children. What can I do to change the behavior of my children? That's called influence. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the next few slides, but I always think that it's beneficial when we talk about a subject to give some of the ideas that others express. In our presentation, we're going to give you 6 strategies or traits that you could have to gain influence. But we're by no means the sole example that you could look at. I always think in teaching classes or talking to our students, conversing with anybody even outside of school, that you should give people as many examples, tools, lists as possible, and let them choose the ones that they think would work best in their situation and their life. Again, we're going to give 6 that we think are the most important. But there's a couple of pretty good lists out there that talk about ways that you can influence. Jesse Stoner gave one that's called 8 Portals of Influence. By the way, I tend to try to get lists that are between 5 and 6 bullets. I always feel more than that, it's harder for people to remember. This one's 8, and it's a good list, but I just want to highlight the very first one, character. Character is the most important. As most of you know, when you give a list, they're often listed in importance, including on your resume. If the first bullet is tended to be the most important, followed by the second, third, fourth, and fifth. And so Jesse has indicated character. The next one that I'm offering, if you want to take a look at that later, is by Jay Conger, who was from USC, and there's 4 that they listed, from networking, constructive persuasion, consultation, and coalition building. Very much a team-oriented approach in this one. And so there's 2 differences. You'll see some similarities with the list that we come up with, but there's 2 similarities there, or 2 examples, and then we'll go into what we think. The keys to influence. And I'll show you in our next, with the remaining parts of our presentation, there's 6 keys to influence. In other words, if you want to have influence in your environment, however you define your environment, there's 6 keys that you have to have. And we're going to go through each one fairly slow so we can understand it. And I have quite a few stories to really showcase the examples of each. So first, you want to show the value and the reward of change. Again, we're going to go through each one. Second is you want to have something someone wants. That's a great discussion. The third one is superior communication skills. Fourth is to be respected. Fifth is to be likable. And sixth is to be confident and inspiring. What's interesting is many of you have come, obviously, at the beginning of this presentation, and it's great how similar your ideas were about how to gain influence are the ones that we have in this presentation, which means that you all are thinking about along the right realm. You need to have more than one, of course, and so hopefully out of this discussion you'll see that that these skills are easy to obtain. If you keep them at the forefront, you'll find that you do much better in influencing your environment when you keep these in mind. So let's go to the first one, which is really, I would call this the foundation. Change. Change replaces the security of what is known for the insecurity of what is unknown. Change is almost always resisted unless it benefits a person. And so remember what influence was when we started out. Influence is changing your behavior so that you can change somebody else's behavior, or simply figuring out how to change somebody else's behavior. Well, you would not need influence if everybody did things the way you wanted. But the reason you want to have influence is because you want somebody else to do things the way you want. As simple as that. And what we're saying in this first slide is change is going to be resisted. So what we want to tell you is to give you the background about how to change something. Whether it is the workplace or the amount of money you spend, how to change things. And so we've just given you the 5 things that you can start to think about when you try to change things. First, change is a natural part of life. Everything changes. I always get it's comical to me sometimes when I hear people that said, well, I don't like change. I do not like change at all. And I tell them, well, how about if I double your pay? Oh, I like that. And right away I tell them, well, you shouldn't like it because it's a change. We're doubling your pay. Well, it's not that I don't like change. I just don't like change that maybe doesn't favor me. Few people will say that. But I don't know very many people in life that do not like change as long as it benefits them. And on this whole slide, the one thing I want to point out about change, and it also goes to influence, is anytime you change something, you have to think about how it's going to benefit somebody else. And that is what you promote. Change is almost always accepted when people see that it's in their best interest to change.
Here's a little tip.
Oh, go ahead,
I was
Henry.
just going to throw out a little tip on that. In my work, my life has been responsibility without authority. So the only way to get things done is to be able to influence. And I worked a lot as an executive coach to CEOs, and I recall this one instance where one of the sales director, wanted to work from home 1 day a week. He had a young family. He could get everything done. And the CEO, and I brought this to the CEO, and he said, no way, no, we're never going to do that, and totally resisted. In the past, I might have said, well, this is really important. He's a good employee, blah, blah, blah. But as Dean has said, haven't found what's of interest or importance to the CEO. So the key here, and this is one of the things I did, was to ask him a question. And the question was, it sounds like you've had a bad experience with that. Can you tell me a little bit more? So I got him talking. Turns out he had 2 employees that did not work when they got the 1 day at home, and they had never done it that way, so he was never going to do it that way again. I said, oh, so you got burned? He said, yeah, darn straight I did. I said, okay, so if you had a situation where the person did work at home 1 day and was able to get all this done and was successful, would that be something you'd be interested in? I said, well, yeah, well, how's that going to happen? So there you have the dialogue. So the key to remember, because when I go through these seminars and I get all these great tips, I always think, how am I going to do that? Well, one key way is to separate interests from positions. Don't get locked in. Just start asking questions. It makes a huge difference, and you get more information with which to begin the dialogue.
Perfect. When I think of showing the value and the reward of change, I often think of Barack Obama. And if people remember when he first ran for election, and this isn't a political statement, when he first ran for president, almost his whole platform was he wanted a more collaborative foreign policy. He wanted to work with Congress. And the big statement was, change you can believe in. And his thought was, we're going to change this country, and it can be done. And it's going to benefit you. Again, I'm not making a political statement, but it's interesting how much of his message was change that you can believe in. He didn't say him, you can believe in, and that things would be different. So on that slide, take a look at some of the challenges of change, but also if you understand the root, how change can occur, it's much easier to facilitate change, that it is a natural part. And again, like I said, you really have to show that change is advantageous to somebody. The more advantageous people see about doing something different, the easier it is for them to change. And if you can get people to change, if you understand how to get people to change, then you can influence them in the future. You have to break them out of that box. The second slide talks about, the second of the 6, talks about you have to have something somebody wants. Well, yeah, there you go. And this means that in order to influence somebody, you have to have something that they want from you. And some of you may have seen 60 Minutes this last Sunday, and they had a profile on Darrelle Revis, who's a football player. And I think he said he had 5 contracts in 6 years. But it was a fascinating profile of him. He's known as the #1 cornerback or defensive player in the NFL. And he said something that night, Sunday night, in the 60 Minutes profile. He said that he has a value and he has worth. And because of that, people are willing to pay it. he also says that you have to be good, then you can take what the market will bear. And those are quotes from his presentation. So Darrell Rivas has influence because he's good. So you have to figure out what people want, and if you have it, you have influence. If you're trying to influence a superior, remember, it's harder to influence a superior than a subordinate because you don't have authority over your superior. But if you're also a fantastic worker, there you have it. You can influence your supervisor. You can go to your supervisor and say, you know, I'd like to move to our place in Texas, or, you know, to the office in Texas. And they may agree to do that because you're so good and they don't want to lose you. So figure out how to have some kind of influence. The third one talks about communication skills. This is something that everybody can get better at. And superior communication skills is the way that you relate to other people. And I remember many years ago hearing about Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan was president 25 years ago. And Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House of Representatives. And Tip O'Neill, they were on different parties, political parties. And Tip O'Neill said he knew everybody from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan was the best communicator he ever heard. Tip O'Neill said if you give him a prepared text, he was the best he's ever seen. And that was what was such an important part of Ronald Reagan. They called him the great communicator. And of course, he won 2 landslide elections as president, and even now he's known for the way that he can convey a speech. Even some of the worst men in history, and women, were...
One thing about Ronald Reagan, this is not a political statement, but you do often hear he was a superior communicator. A couple of things that I saw he did was he was very genuine. It was like you watched him interact with people. In a room, it would be like you were the only one in the room with him. So he was very genuine, and he was humble. He had a sense of humor. And those things went a long way towards superior communication skills. So regardless of what you feel about him politically, I think most people in either party would say, yes, he was able to communicate and influence a lot of people.
Absolutely. And when we talk about the Republican of Ronald Reagan, maybe I should talk also about a Democrat who is also had superior communication skills. And if you YouTube Jesse Jackson, he gave a speech at the 1984 Democratic Convention. I still remember it to this day. And he had lost the nomination, but he gave a rousing speech where he continued making the statement, you got to keep hope alive. And he talked about human rights and said, keep hope alive. And he talked about education. He said, keep hope alive. And he talked about caring for the ages. And he said, keep hope alive. And he inspired everybody in that convention hall. And it really cemented his reputation as a serious man, interesting in pursuing and hopefully achieving a better world. And with that speech, he inspired millions to join his cause. It was really that speech that made Jesse Jackson. And the influence that he walked out of that convention with was unrivaled. And so there's 2 examples on a national stage where people, because of the way that they were able to connect with their audience, were able to influence that audience. Even to this day, people still talk about it.
Dean, you said something earlier that was really provocative, that when we talk about influence, and of course at Walden we stress ethical skills and being highly ethical, right. But as you mentioned before, there have been communicators in our history that have influenced lots of people, and they've done it for evil intent. So there is a difference in how you do that, and of course we're advocating always be ethical and concerned with the other person. Exactly.
And we're on the 3rd bullet, which is superior communication skills, and Henry aptly points out that later in the presentation, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about something called goodness and decency and those kinds of things. So that's superior communication skills. You can go throughout the list of people who mesmerize you just by the way they talk. It's amazing. And that's influence. That's the 3rd one. The 4th one is respect. And many of you mentioned that. Whether you're a sports hero or a movie star, an artist, There's a reason that we pay $5 and $10 and $15 million for an athlete or a movie star to promote a product. They do that because they know the movie star or the sports hero will sell the product. In fact, many sports athletes make more money in endorsements than they do in salary. Think of Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is a billionaire mainly because of his Nike shoes, not from what he made on the court. In fact, he owns a basketball team now. Tiger Woods is another one. Many people have made hundreds of millions of dollars based on their image because at that time and at that place, they're largely respected by the public. And it's amazing the influence that they have, not just on the youth, but just on anybody who's in their sphere of influence, including older individuals. I go back to Michael Jordan, and what we learned is be like Mike. They were telling a generation, be like Mike. If you wear these shoes, you'll be like Mike. You can go back even into the religious realm where Pope Francis, hardly anybody has met him, but millions are enthralled with the way that he lives his life. He believes that you should help those that are the less fortunate, those who don't have a chance in life or very little chance. And he says that you should pursue this over your own selfish aims is what his message is. To always give back. And people respect a person like that who's willing to sacrifice themselves and their own future for other people. So
one real quick point to echo these points that you're making, Dean, which are excellent and so true. But there's some of us, they took a few zeros off our paycheck compared to Michael Jordan and some of those other people. So what I wanted to share with you, I bet none of you have heard of Dudley Baxter. Dudley Baxter was a janitor. And when I was going to graduate school, he'd come in at midnight when I was working in my office. He was the smartest guy I ever knew and was really self-confident. And I said, well, Dudley, you could have done so many things. He said, I wanted to be a janitor. I'm really good at it. I like it. And just the way he carried himself, he wasn't going to influence millions of people, but he influenced us on a one-on-one. So what message I'd like to throw out there is whatever we do, we don't have to be, it's helpful if we're rich and influential, but we don't have to be able to influence others. So we always want to keep that in mind.
That's a great point. In fact, rather than talk about somebody famous as well, I'll give another story about Osiella McCarty, which most people probably don't remember. She died, probably about 15 years ago. She was raised in, I believe, Mississippi. Never got to go to college because when she was in the 6th grade, she had to drop out because her mother got ill. And so she never had a college education, and she did laundry and ironing all of her life. And towards the end of her life, she had saved $166,000. And she said, she was in her 80s, I think, at the time, she said, I'm going to give all that money to the University of Southern Mississippi, I think is university, and found a scholarship. And she wanted that money to go to people like her who weren't able to follow their dream because of life circumstances. You should look her up if you get a chance, because President Clinton at the time found out about her story and invited her to the White House. It's the first time she's ever been on a plane. And she became a national celebrity. And there's somebody who saved their money. She never had an air conditioner, never had a car, saved her money. And what she did with it at the end of her life was to help somebody else who was in the same situation as her. I remembered that story for 15, 20 years. It's somebody that I greatly respect. And yet, and I think she won over 300 awards at that time because of how famous she became. And I bet you she influenced a lot of people to do something with their life because of the respect that they had for the way that she carried herself. She wasn't a sports hero or movie star, but she became something that was just an amazing person. Fourth, likable. I love this one. Some of you talked about being likable. I have always said, if you work hard and you're likable, you can be just about anything you want in life. You can have almost any success that you want if you work hard and if you're likable. Will Smith is a likable person. Tom Hanks is a likable person. They have a likable image, and people pay to see them. They pay to be around them. and you become influenced by these people because you like them and you want to be like them. That's so important to become a likable person. In fact, I did a little study and found out, as I was researching likability and likable, that the most likable country in the world, anybody want to take a guess what that country is? Voted by a big poll, was actually Canada, very close to the United States. And it was followed by Sweden, the Netherlands, and Norway. What's interesting is that second, third, and fourth are in Northern Europe, the same cluster. It's kind of amazing. These are places that you want to go because here's the key thing, they make you feel good. And here in the United States, it reminds me of the bar Cheers, that show Cheers, where the song says where everybody knows your name, and every time Norm would walk in, people would go, Norm. People want that. They want to feel liked. And if you can make somebody else feel liked, they will follow you, not to the ends of the earth, but they would follow you because you make them feel good. That's what it is about likable. If you make people feel that you care about them, that you like them, that their interest is your interest, if you can figure out how to do that, you will have influence in almost any environment that you have. And that brings us to the last one, which is confidence and inspiring. We talked about the first slide, which is change. Change is very daunting. People resist change. So if you can figure out a way to reduce that change, then you have a better chance of having influence. And the sixth and final one that you can do to gain more influence is to be confident. Leaders need followers, and followers need to be assured that the direction they're going is not only achievable, but worthwhile. So what's achievable? People want to spend time on things that will work, on things that they can achieve, and they don't want to invest time and effort if you can't reach the so-called brass ring, if you can't achieve your ambitions. So it has to be something that people realize that I can do this. You know, if you work out for 6 months, you will get stronger. People want to realize that that can happen. And that's achievable. Let's talk about worthwhile. There was also on 60 Minutes a presentation on Make-A-Wish. And the Make-A-Wish Foundation has been around since 1980, long time. And it started with a 7-year-old boy. He had a dying wish. He wanted to be a motorcycle cop. And the lady that founded Make-A-Wish worked with the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and they fulfilled this young boy's wish. Unfortunately, he died a month later, but it started the Make-A-Wish. They wanted, in some way, to give people a wish. And today, that group collects over $100 million a year. There's 25,000 volunteers. And it's a foundation, and it is an organization that exists just to promote wishes to people who have serious illnesses. And so it's worthwhile. And so if you're trying to influence an environment, pick something where you're confident you're going to achieve it, and it's got to be worthwhile to achieve. And that's what's an important part of that. So go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, just one quick thing to that. As you were talking, I was thinking about many of us have taken public speaking courses, and we've had to speak in front of others. And there was one poll once that identified public speaking as more fearful than death. Actually, I'd rather try public speaking. But to make a long story just a little bit longer, if you go into a situation, we've all been in it, I'm sure, where we're thinking, oh, the audience isn't going to like me. They're going to think I'm boring. I don't know my stuff. I'm going to forget my lines. If we change that to be confident, like Dean's talking about, think about looking at it as, I've got something to share. I'm really excited about it. It's going to make a difference. Then when you walk in that room, find 1 or 2 people that are smiling and focus on them. It will give you so much energy, and you come across so much more confident. It's really mind-boggling. So it's something that we can all do. We really can.
Perfect. And so some concluding thoughts. The first thing I want everybody to remember is this is all doable. This is a very doable presentation. Every single one of us in this presentation can gain more influence. And as we've shown you with the 6 strategies, they are all learnable. It just takes an investment of your time and recognizing that this is what I have to do in order to gain influence. Secondly, these are all personal characteristics for the most part. Communication skills and likability. So these are doable things, and absolutely you can gain influence from some, I think in some ways, simple characteristics. But I think, to give you one more example as we conclude and then we'll ask some questions, is that one of the most, I found, hardworking, respectable, likable, inspiring persons of certainly this last century was Mother Theresa. And she founded the Missionaries of Charity, which consisted of about 4,500 sisters in 133 countries. And they ran hospices and homes for people with AIDS, with leprosy and tuberculosis, soup kitchens, did clinics, and also schools. And most know that she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, but maybe the greatest respect paid to her life when she passed away was from the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who said that, quote, she was a rare and unique individual who lived long for higher purposes. Her lifelong devotion to the care of the poor, the sick, and the disadvantaged was one of the highest examples of service to our humanity, end quote. What is most interesting about that statement is, if anybody knows about India and Pakistan is the arch enemy of India. And for somebody in Pakistan to actually say that about their fellow country, their country next door, really talked about the influence that Mother Teresa has, not just as a citizen of India, but a citizen throughout the world. And therein lies at the heart of gaining influence, which I hope everybody remembers. That yes, you have to know how to change, you have to have something somebody wants, and you have to be able to communicate well within your environment. But it's those personal characteristics that determine your ability to influence those within your world. So work hard, be likable, be respected, and be inspiring, which we learned about in our earlier slides. Become a Jesse Jackson, a Margaret Thatcher, a Mother Teresa. And if you pursue the right ambitions in a decent and noble manner, then you really can influence the world to become a better place to live. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Yes, actually, Dean, we do have a question. Can you give some specific examples of how to have influence in personal relationships where authority is equal and you may not have anything that the other person wants? Is influence possible?
It's absolutely possible, and we see it nearly every day. And so you're talking about in the workplace?
Well, Mallory said personal relationships. So
personal relationships?
Maybe family member?
Yeah, and I think the first thing that comes to mind is likability and respect. For instance, most people respect their elders, and we've heard that statement, you must respect your elders. And so there's a reason why you must respect your elders. Often elders have more influence in a family. In fact, there's a great Chinese quote that says something like an 80-year-old can learn from an 81-year-old. And what they mean is that there's experience to be gained with the number of years that you have on earth. And so respect is one way that you can do it. Live your life in a way that other people that you interact with, whether it's a spouse, significant other, child, or grandparent, or parent, respects the way that you live your life. That's one way. And the other is likability. If you like somebody, you tend to do more for them. And have you ever found yourself saying, gosh, I keep going over to help this person, I keep going over to help that person, and if somebody asks you, why do you do that, it kind of comes down to, I like them. When you have to do something, you're less apt to do it. When you want to do something, you're more apt to do it. And that's those two factors of living a respected life and being a likable person are the two most important factors on a personal relationship that gain you influence.
Just to tag on to that, I think those are great points. One thing about personal relationships, and Mallory, I don't see the question in front of me, but I'll say this, with personal relationships, we have a way we've interacted with that person that has a history, often very different from professional relationships. They see us in a certain way. So when you start to do the things that Dean's recommending, and these are excellent recommendations, being likable, being respectful, asking questions, at first they may not buy into it and they'll respond defensively. But if, and there's research behind this, if you persist over time, you stay positive, you do the same thing, gradually they'll begin to see that change and it will impact them. what you do will impact them. It just takes a little bit more time, but it can and will happen.
Another question, what about the question of access? Because what if you're really likable and you're working really hard and you've got a really good brand in the workplace, but you just don't have the ears of the key decision makers who could, for example, give you resources for your area?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And that goes to the heart of the difference between authority and power. So you may find yourself out of the loop. First of all, you don't have authority. You don't have authority to make yourself part of the group. So that wipes out the authority, which means all you have to rely on is power, influence through power. And Henry's so right about what he just said. There's no magic bullet that says tomorrow you're going to gain influence. Influence through power, through the type of person that you are, through the type of person that you became, takes time. If you remember, one of the things that one of the persons on here talked about when we did the poll was character. The word character actually means, if you look at enduring marks. And a good way to think about character is if you take a slice into marble, those marks remain. That is who you are. So you have to live a life that, because of the way you live your life, likable, respected, those types of things, that is who you become. And people, it takes time, but eventually people recognize and appreciate that. And another good example to help bring this home is when you start a job at a new firm, you don't have much influence because you're the new person. It takes time for you, we're going to call it your reputation. It takes time for you to develop a reputation. You hope you develop the right reputation. And when you do develop the right reputation, you'll find that your influence soars. So it takes time, but if you take some of these characteristics and implement them, there will be a time that you gain influence in your environment.
One other suggestion on that would be, and these are great suggestions, find somebody in the organization that's well respected and well connected, one that's in the in crowd. Go to them, ask them, tell them what you desire to do with your future, and ask them to mentor you. They'll be flattered. And once they start mentoring you, they'll open doors for you. And that's just another way to maybe shorten the cycle a bit. But as Dean says, it does take time. It's just another approach.
That's an excellent suggestion, yes.
Another question that we have from Lila, would the same 6 strategies be recommended for influencing someone online, for example, through social media?
That's a great question. I really like these questions. I think it's a little bit more difficult. And the reason I say that is it's harder to get across personal characteristics online. It's not impossible, but I would agree with that question that I think it's a little bit more difficult. And there's a couple of reasons for that. There's verbal and nonverbal communications. If you're talking to somebody one-on-one, you're able to display both. They can not only hear your words, but they can see your expressions, the excitement that you have on your face. All of those really play a part in being likable, being respected, being inspiring. That's a reason why advertisers pay millions of dollars for advertisements, because they know if you see it, you can become inspired by it. But, and by the way, it costs more to advertise on TV than it does on radio. And the reason is because advertisers know it's more influential when you can see it than if you can just hear it. So I think whoever put that question in is right. I think you have to work harder. It's achievable, but I do think you have to work a little harder. You have to be a little bit more industrious, maybe takes more time to have influence online in that social media than it is on ground. And I'd say one other thing about that. Feedback is important in communication, and it's harder to have immediate direct feedback in the social media than it is when you're face-to-face with somebody. If you give somebody bad news face-to-face, you can see their reaction right away. And so it is a little harder. It takes more time, and you have to be more diligent at it. But I think it's achievable. It's just more difficult. So whoever wrote the question is spot on.
Great. And Nora wants to pass along that he's greatly enjoying this webinar as he works in public relations. So he thinks this is really helpful. So his question, so is showing objectivity in making a point a good way to exercise influence?
Here's where that's really important, and thanks for the compliment. Here's where that's really important. When you show objectivity, you're more believable in the points that you express. It shows, A, that you have a very well-reasoned mind, and secondly, it shows that you're not biased. And those two are very important to gain influence in your environment. People want to believe that you don't have a self-interest at heart. So that's the first part that I talked about. And biases, people are less apt to hear what you're saying if they feel that you're automatically biased in whatever approach. And remember Henry talked about communication earlier, and he talked about listening. People aren't going to want to talk to you if they feel that you're biased in your approach. So I think that goes back to what Henry said very aptly. If you could be as objective as possible, by the way, this is just a little part, but if you noticed I talked about Ronald Reagan, who's a Republican, but I also balanced it with Jesse Jackson, who's a Democrat, trying to show both sides.
Great. Okay. And Terry asked the question, why does power have a negative connotation and make people afraid to use it?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question, too. I don't look at power as a negative. Henry also mentioned about using it. It's how you use it. And I think for us, what we're saying is use it for the good. But I think it's because too many people use it for the bad that it does have a bad reputation.
Great. Actually, I'm going to wrap this question session up with a comment from Linda because I think this is great. I'm taking away from this program, listen first, talk second, write last, and be a hard worker. How do you all feel about that? Does that sound like a good summary?
Nice summary.
Great summary. That's what I thought. Well said.
That is pretty good. I think it's on one of our slides, in fact, right?
Okay.
Yeah, good job.
Remember when you're listening to seek to understand rather than to listen for what you're going to say next. That's the hardest thing, the hardest lesson. But if you can do that, boy, the door's open.
Right. And I like the part about talking second and writing last, because if you can, I mean, I think we're losing so much in terms of face-to-face communication, or even talking on the phone. We're just emailing so much. So, I think if you can, if someone's next door to you, if you can go to the office next to you and talk face-to-face, I think, would you agree that's a lot more effective than, all these emails that we're constantly getting bombarded with?
Well, the problem with the emails is that it's so easy, as Dean had mentioned earlier. We don't have all the nonverbal cues. All we have is the words themselves. And it's so easy for misunderstandings, so much more so than if you're face-to-face or even on the phone, because then you have the tone of voice, you have the silence, you have the volume, you get some more cues. So it's just a little bit more difficult. You have to be careful about what you say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a great statement about communication that when people talk, instead of them listening to what somebody's saying, they're doing what's called planning the attack. So in their mind, they've already moved to, I'm not listening anymore, I'm figuring out what I'm going to say in response. And they may jump in even before the person's done. So you actually have to control, it's hard to do, you have to control your mind to say, no, I'm going to listen, actively listen to this person, then I will respond. So that's something to do.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to pass to Nicole, who's going to wrap it up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. Okay, so Career Center, we highly encourage you to visit our new and improved website and use the Quick Answers. You can see the Quick Answers logo there at the top. It's like a Google search, but within Walden. So if you want resume samples, CV samples, or archive webinars, you can just type it in and it'll take you to those resources. So visit us at careercenter.waldenu.edu. And then definitely join our Career Services LinkedIn group. So to engage and network and hopefully spread your influence, the positive influence. So to get to our LinkedIn group, you can actually go to our Career Center website, and here I'm going to circle with the cursor, click on that LinkedIn icon, and it'll take you right to our group, and then you can click on the join button to join. So we definitely invite all of the Walden community to join our group and participate in our career conversations. And we also promote our webinars on there. And then connect with us in other ways. You can follow us on Twitter. We have an amazing YouTube channel where we share video success stories of our students. We have a blog and are on Facebook, and we do promote many of our webinars and events on these social media outlets. And again, our website, careercenter.waldenu.edu. And I want to end with this final thought. The happy are those who remember that no one has everything, but everyone has something. From Ernest Fitzgerald. And thank you all for joining us.
And thank you so much, Dean and Henry, for being terrific panelists this evening. We so appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you. This was very helpful. And to remind everyone, it will be archived and available on our website within a week.